you earned a doctrine or any form of degree for that matter, because it's not about you being taught the best education possible when you were being taught lies as your education to begin with. It's now beyond black and white issues. It's what's wrong and right issues. For example, over the years, the descendants of the indigenous Aboriginal Niji of Turtle Island, or rather the people that are falsely misclassified as African Americans today, are owed a lot more than just a form of reparations, and those who feel as though they should be paid for their direct ancestors' involvement with the creation and industrialization of the United States of America should be paid. However, just a simple check or lump sum of money given by those who benefited from our ancestors' labor to make amends for the now over 240 years of hereditary damage this capitalist society indulged upon our ancestors does not, in fact, resolve the overall issue. And here's why. Let's take the definition of reparations, for example, the one which is heavily highlighted to the public, stating that reparations is an act of making amends or giving satisfaction for wrongdoing, maybe in a form of payment for damages. But let's look at another definition for reparations, which is an act of repairing or keeping in repair. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Sort of like when you take your car to a mechanic who has plans to fix the initial problem with your car, but somehow more damage is done, so that at a later time you are sure to return to continuously allow that same bad mechanic to work on your car unknowingly. Or I'll give you another example. It's like when you visit your doctor and he or she prescribes you a pill that allegedly cures one problem, but yet it somehow exposes you to several more. This is the problem with reparations. It does not fix the problem. It just covers it up for a certain time period, and yet the problem still persists. Because in order to fix a problem, we must begin at the root of a problem. This is why it is critically important for our people to know the truth about our past in order to see exactly where the problem began. In my previous documentary called The Untold Truth About Reparations, ADOS, and Slavery in America, I shared detailed information about the Civil War, why and how it was a labor dispute, and I also mentioned that Abraham Lincoln did not free so-called African American slaves with the release of the Emancipation Proclamation, or Proclamation 95. But what President Lincoln's Proclamation 95 did do, however, was ended the Civil War by quelling the advancement of military troops upon any people or person who did not agree with the United States government. Instead of fighting, it was urged by politicians for people to bring their disputes to Congress, but only through a representative of each state. This is how the United States was established, having learned how to govern the 13 colonies by watching the operations of the previous confederacies our ancestors owned. I will go into more detail about this later on in another segment, but what is important to note here is that in order to restore the Union upon the remaining confederacies that would eventually turn into governments of each state, a set of reparations had to be agreed upon in favor of the copper-colored landowners, sharecroppers, or the Negro farmers, making this one of the main possible reasons why Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Now, reparations could have been delayed for the people of color due to a few factors. One, a study has never been conducted by any creditable source in order to discover just how much in a form of payment should the employees between 1776 and now be compensated for their binding contracts of forced labor. 2. There were subdivisions doing business as institutions, agencies, banks, and corporations that history fails to mention who worked as liaisons of the U.S. government, directly involving themselves with funding both sides of the 61 documented wars of the 1800s by creating loopholes and other schemes that forced our ancestors out of their own lands here in America. and also with streamlining the industrialized version of slavery that still exists today. 3. These companies were never held responsible for their actions in a courtroom, which makes it even more reason to reveal who should be held responsible still in order to bridge the gap between justice and equality for the indigenous Aboriginal Niji right now. The majority of bonds that were paid off by employers in order to hire prisoners of war as their new employees were done so by either bartering or loaning contracts out to employers as a form of business credit. This method remains intact still today. A bond is a, quote, promise to repay the principal along with interest on a specific date. Some bonds do not pay interest, but all bonds require a repayment of principal. When an investor buys a bond, he or she becomes a creditor of the issuer, end quote. So since the so-called slave master, or rather the employer, becomes the creditor, and the so-called slave holder, or rather the issuer of the bond, is the investor, then both parties are not only responsible for funding slavery, but should be held responsible for refunding the so-called slaves. Keep in mind that our ancestors were under the impression that they were not working for free, and that this form of slavery or blind capitalism will benefit everyone, especially those who were the majority of the help that literally built America from the ground up, due to promises or contracts that were never upheld by the promising parties. Hence the term indentured servitude. The noun indenture is a, quote, written formal contract for services, a deed with mutual covenants. So, who are these people that should be held responsible for the millions of broken promises, compulsory educational institutions, unpaid laborers, and unpaid military soldiers who fought and died for the uprising of this country, destroyed legacies, cultures and spiritualities, inequality in workplaces, generational poverty, stolen land allotments, racism, concentration camps turned project housing reserved for only a large median of people of color, identity theft and paper genocide, and many, many years of injustice and discrimination? The answer to this question is very complex and will require me to produce multiple segments surrounding this topic to break it all down. But here's a critical example to make note of. The majority of our people now can recall hearing stories about how their ancestors and even some living elders were former sharecroppers, landowners, or farmers. And the way Hollywood paints the picture of American Indians should make you question why you would rarely see authentic photographs, painted or engraved images of the Hollywood depicted version of American Indians working in the fields anywhere across the southeastern region of North America. So, how would millions of American Indians be able to survive if they didn't know how to farm? And for that matter, when did the American Indians have time to set some time aside to teach millions of so-called enslaved American Negroes how to farm? Before these same millions of American Negroes taught the incoming white foreigners from Europe and Africa how to farm? The answer is very simple. The American Indian is the American Negro.
You're looking to buy a new truck, and this truck won't be any old truck. In fact, you want nothing but the best, maybe even the best of the best of the best. Look no further than the Ram trucks at Jim Butler, the Ram Powerhouse. We have the best Ram truck selection, best trade-in values, and even the best price guaranteed. Shop over 100 Ram trucks at cdjrpowerhouse.com.
Jim Butler is the Ram Powerhouse.
Join us during Ram Power Days. Anyone can say they're the best at HVAC, but no one works harder to prove it than Rehagen Heating and Cooling.
Every single installation is our most important. At Rehagen, we believe in American-made products by Daikin. Daikin provides 12-year warranties because their products are super dependable.
With affordable financing and rebates available, you can now get a top-of-the-line system for the same price as a standard unit.
At Rehagen Heating and Cooling, we've maintained the same great customer service and work ethic for over 40 years, so you can trust in Rehagen Heating and Cooling.
King, you liken these payments to slave reparations, but just factually speaking, how can you say that? These payments are not for anyone descended from slaves. These are payments, they're not even for black farmers who were discriminated against all throughout the 1900s. They're payments specifically for black farmers who the USDA admits were being discriminated against between 1983 and 1997. So how are these slave reparations?
Well, I've sat on the Judiciary Committee for 8 years. I sat through slavery reparation hearings that were held by Chairman John Conyers, and of course through the hearings here on the Pickford Farms claims. And the motivation that comes from this looks to me like there's no resistance on the part of the proponents to hold back or look for fraud in this. They just simply seem to be content with every black farmer that would apply would get what was defined as Judge Friedman and in his opinion as virtually an automatic payment.
Dr. Boyd, let me just ask you specifically, though, staying on this topic. I mean, Representative King has talked about a hypothetical Johnny who was born on a farm but, quote, went off to the city, became a drug addict, and now wants the $50,000 that comes from the USDA under this claim. How strict is the vetting of these claims?
Well, first of all, I think that that statement has a terrible racial undertone and very, very offensive to our black farmers. And we need to forget here, we help feed the country. We help feed the world. And we paid our price to be in this country and to own land. And what the government done to black farmers is wrong. How strict is the vetting? I mean, Representative King is saying just about anybody who's African American can claim to have been a farmer. So how strict is it? The consent decree says African Americans who farmed or attempted to farm between 1981 and 1997. And the reason we use that definition is because the Civil Rights Office at USDA was closed under the Reagan administration. And we went in and found and investigated and found thousands of black farmer civil rights cases that had never been processed. And that's what this case is about. This case is not about fraud. This case is about bringing justice and equality and fairness to a group of people who deserve it. And it's long overdue justice. Congressman King, it is pretty shocking when you start to look into what happened in the USDA. I mean, they were literally throwing out discrimination claims, just dumping them in the garbage in some cases. You claim 75% of the claims now being made in this program by African-American farmers have been fraudulent. You say an unnamed person working for the USDA gave you that estimate. USDA says that percentage is complete nonsense. The FBI has investigated, they say, found only 3 cases of fraud. Where's the proof of this 75% claim you made?
Well, and John Boyd says that there's no fraud. The FBI or the USDA has reported that the FBI came up with 3 cases that they prosecuted. Now, what is the level of fraud here? I've said that I had a district director who was deployed to Washington, D.C. to help administer the distribution of the first $1.05 billion under Pickford. He came back, he among others, with stacks of copies of the documents, sick at heart, and he said at least 75% are fraudulent. And so we can't say that there's no fraud here. Here's what we know. Judge Friedman put in his decision, he wrote 40 acres and a mule in his decision. So I'm not making this part up about reparations. That is the words, that's the code words for reparations.
Wait a minute, sir. I've read that decision, and he just started $500. Sir, I've read that decision, and he just used that in a recitation about the history of the interaction between African Americans and the U.S. government and the USDA. He wasn't equating 40 acres and a mule to this program.
Well, and also
let me say, though, Anderson, that he laments that he can't fix all the wrongs of slavery and segregation in one civil rights case. Now he's got a second one.
Mr. King, I want Dr. Boyd to be able to respond. Dr. Boyd?
Let me talk here. The farmers deserve this restitution. It's long overdue for the black farmers. This is not a rush to judgment. Mr. King has known about this issue. I've testified before him many times before. And this case is about African-American farmers who farmed or attempted to farm, who was discriminated against by the United States Department of Agriculture. And I can tell you about discrimination because I had a county official to spit on me and to tear my application up and throw it in the trash can. And I begged and pleaded with the committee to have that person fired. That person was never fired. He was transferred to another county office to continue to work out his service for the United States Department of Agriculture, and they gave him a big party, a big retirement party. So I can tell you that this discrimination is real, and I invite Mr. King to walk in my shoes and other black farmers' shoes around this country before he pass judgment and refer to him as Johnny or someone that has a drug problem. And I tell you that, Anderson, these farmers have proven their case, and they deserve to have their cases heard based on its merit.
I'm just here to make you think.